This is Unit 5B Extra Credit Test Review for AP Euro. And I've got a series of questions here, and all I'm going to do is simply go through these questions, tell you what I think of them. And so the first question is this one. What was the most important reason that the leaders of the new French Republic voted to execute King Louis XVI? So here's what I'm thinking. The King, Louis XVI, and his whole family, they were in prison in Paris. He's put on trial and easily convicted of treason. The evidence was overwhelming. The king did a horrible job of defending himself. The newly elected National Convention voted by a comfortable majority to execute him, not because he was guilty, not because they felt he deserved it. Nobody was really deluded about that. It was because his very existence threatened the Republic. As long as he was alive, the very real threat that he could be restored to the throne by someone, by anyone, still existed. And this threat was so real that even Robespierre, who had previously been against the death penalty, called for the death of the king. So this next one, what were some cultural reflections of the new republic? Some cultural things that reflected this new republic, its ideas and all that stuff. There are a lot of things that reflected or pushed the public's acceptance of the republic and the new ideals of equality and liberty that the republic stood for. And we identified some examples of this too. For example, we talked about how people stopped wearing aristocratic fashions, and playing cards were published without the kings and queens and jacks on them. Each card featured an Enlightenment philosophe or expressed some kind of a Republican value, for example, like equality of color or freedom of religion. Some towns changed their names to names that celebrated the Republic or the Enlightenment in some way. There was a new Republican calendar to replace the old Gregorian calendar with its Christian holidays. And this new calendar was scientifically based, and it was organized around Republican heroes and natural seasons. So this thing about this de-Christianization campaign or de-Christianization movement in France, to know about that. Here's some things to know about it. The de-Christianization campaign went on for a number of years, and it taught that the church was superstitious, fanatical, ignorant, evil, because it propped up the nobility and it participated in privilege and inequality. Ultimately, this de-Christianization movement didn't catch on, but it did have lasting effects on French society. And it was largely a provincial initiative. The National Convention never officially endorsed it. Robespierre himself was actually against it. But many deputies from the National Convention participated in it, especially when they went out to the provinces on mission from Paris. Churches all over France were converted to other uses, particularly the Republican temples of reason. Priests were often intimidated into quitting or getting married, and these actions were carried out often in openly blasphemous and defamatory and disrespectful ways. Festivals of reason occurred all over France. There was a big festival of reason that took place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame with all kinds of idolatrous images and symbols that exalted reason and the state and the Enlightenment. And all of these images replaced images of God in the cathedral. So this next one, can you describe the various political factions of the National Convention? Jacobins, Girondins, the Mountain, the Plain. So let's start with the Girondins. The Girondins were pro-war, pro-property, pro-free market. They wanted the Republic. They liked having the Republic, but they wanted to slow the revolution down. During the days of the Legislative Assembly, they had hesitated to overthrow the king. And during the National Convention, now that the National Convention was going on, they had not wanted to execute the king, but he got executed anyway by a vote. The Jacobins were more liberal than the Girondins. They were egalitarian. They were for universal male suffrage. They were more enthusiastic about the Republic than the Girondins. And The Montagnards, or the Mountain, they were the most radical members of this Jacobin club. They were ultra-revolutionaries. They had the closest association with the Sans-Culottes and the Paris Commune, each of which were quite radical. The Plain was what you called the unaffiliated guys in the middle, between the Girondins and the Jacobins, who support the Jacobins and the Girondins competed with each other for. So why did the people of the Vendée region go to war against the French Republic? For the Vendée, it wasn't so much about politics as it was about the disruption of their traditional way of life. Their feudal dues in the Vendée and their church tithes had always been comparatively light compared to what other people in France were paying. So they were actually paying more in taxes now with the Republic than they used to pay in dues and tithes. They were also a religiously conservative area who felt very close to their priests. They had a lot of respect for their priests. So the civil constitution of the clergy and that oath to the nation that the clergy had to take and the de-Christianization movement were all very disruptive to life in the Vendée and disruptive to their worldview. They had had great reverence for the king, who was now dead at the hands of the Republic. And finally, they didn't like the levée en masse, the forced recruitment campaign to draft their young men as soldiers for the war effort. How can we describe the Constitution of 1793 and its impact? The Constitution of 1793 was a constitution that was put together very hastily and voted on very quickly in the summer of 1793. There was so much crisis going on that it was widely felt that a constitution was vital to bring some kind of legal stability to the nation. And it was a very liberal constitution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which had been the first section of the previous constitution, was expanded to include the right to subsistence and the right to education. It also had universal male suffrage and direct elections, no electoral college. And then it was put in a cedar box and not implemented until such time as it would be feasible given the current crises. But everyone understood the principles that had comprised this new constitution, and these became commonplace even without its official implementation. So what happened to these Girondins at the National Convention, and what caused it, and what effect did it have? So many people and factions in Paris did not trust the Girondins with the Republic. They were in charge of the war, which was going badly. One of their own handpicked generals, Dumouriez, had defected to Austria. We'll talk about him a little bit more in a second. They had tried and failed to get the Mountain member Jean-Paul Marat convicted of sedition against the convention. That failed. And finally, in May of 1793, the Sans-Culottes surrounded the convention and demanded the arrest of 29 Girondin deputies. And this move to purge them from the National Convention led to a firestorm outside of Paris. Conservative Republicans rose up against the Jacobins in various parts of France in what became the Federalist Revolt. So that was the effect that this arrest had, this purge had. So what did the defection of Charles-François Dumouriez, failure on the battlefield, and the disastrous attempt to convict Jean-Paul Marat of sedition all lead to? And we kind of just answered that. So these two questions have a lot of redundancy here. But just to say a little bit more, the purge of the Girondins from the National Convention was the big result. That's what it led to. Dumouriez was one of the Girondins' own men, and it made the Girondins look complicit in his scheme to use the army to take Paris from the National Convention and from the Paris Commune. Of course, his army would not obey him. They wouldn't go along, and he wound up running over to Austria. So this Charlotte Corday, we know who Jean-Paul Marat is. What did they do, and what did it all cause? You know, one of the things that we see with all of this stuff with the Republic and all that, is you do see a very strong, consistent through line as far as cause and effect goes. So Charlotte Corday, she was a Federalist sympathizer, a Republican, and she was from Normandy. And she decided that she was going to take it upon herself to travel to Paris alone and hunt down and kill Jean-Paul Marat. He was a radical member of the Mountain who had his newspaper, The Friend of the People, and who preached incessantly about having the heads of the Republic's perceived enemies. Many Parisians considered Jean-Paul Marat their watchdog and their hero. And when Charlotte Corday killed him, she was tried, she was convicted, and she was executed in just 4 days. The Girondin leaders were blamed for the death of Marat. The Federalist revolt had begun as a response to the purge of the Girondins from the National Convention. And so on September the 5th, thousands of Parisians surrounded the National Convention and demanded that the convention get tough with these enemies of the Republic through the use of what they called terror. And so this next question is, what exactly was the Reign of Terror? And I defined it like this in our slides, and so I'm going to say it again. The Reign of Terror was a centralized, coordinated, last-ditch, all-hands-on-deck campaign by the Jacobin-led National Convention to pull the Republic from certain death at the hands of multiple national emergencies. And these emergencies included international war, civil war, political revolt, massive inflation, food shortages, and two official institutions that the National Convention basically repurposed, if you will, to conduct this Reign of Terror were the Committee of Public Safety and the Revolutionary Tribunal. These two institutions had already been created before the Reign of Terror started, but as the terror ramped up, these two institutions were given wider powers and more responsibilities. And so, what were some things about the Reign of Terror that might be kind of surprising? A number of things, actually. There's like 5 or 6 things that I thought of that were kind of surprising about the Reign of Terror, things you wouldn't normally think of. For example, some teachers suggest that the Committee of Public Safety imposed a command economy upon France where they controlled the prices of literally everything and the market had absolutely no say whatsoever. They actually imposed price controls on 39 vital commodities whose market prices were going out of control. And they called this imposition the general maximum. And these prices were controlled by the general maximum because they were hurting the poor, and they're also hindering the government's ability to secure these commodities for use in the war effort. So that's one big surprise. Another big surprise about the Committee of Public Safety is that Maximilien Robespierre did not have a stranglehold on the Committee of Public Safety. He was a member, but it was really a team of 12 deputies of diverse backgrounds. Some of them were allies of Robespierre, some of them were opponents of Robespierre. A third big surprise about the Reign of Terror was that most of the executions in the Reign of Terror took place out in the provinces, where there were open rebellions, such as the Vendée and the city of Lyon, rather than actually in Paris. Another surprise is that the Committee of Public Safety did not coordinate the de-Christianization movement. Some deputies were for it, some were against it. Robespierre, as I've already mentioned, himself was against the de-Christianization movement. The National Convention did endorse de-Christianization in indirect ways. For example, the new Republican calendar, having a festival of reason in the middle of the Notre Dame Cathedral, and celebrating the first anniversary of the king's overthrow with a festival that was devoid of any Christian symbolism at all. But de-Christianization, as I said before, was primarily a grassroots movement. Some deputies supported it when they went out on mission from the National Convention. It just depended on the province, and it depended on the leanings of the deputies themselves. And the Committee of Public Safety played a very limited role. They might help to close down a local church, particularly if it helped them meet some of their other goals. And finally, and this may be the biggest surprise, the Committee of Public Safety didn't just coordinate the war effort. They didn't just root out and suppress the Republic's enemies. They didn't just provide economic relief to the poor or price controls. They also instituted significant social reform, abolishing slavery, getting rid of the last of the seigneurial dues from the old feudalism, reforming family inheritance and marriage laws to give more favor to women, more than they previously had, promoting the new calendar, opening primary schools for both boys and girls, making the purchase of confiscated church lands more equitable, state welfare, pensions, etc. All of these reforms, all these social reforms were done during the Reign of Terror. And last but not least, keep in mind that the violence of the Reign of Terror was not unique to the Reign of Terror. There was plenty of violence and bloodshed both before the Terror and after the Terror. Keep in mind, there was a major war going on, and that war continued long after the Reign of Terror. So how can we describe the composition and function of the Committee of Public Safety? And this is, again, a bit redundant, but just to recap, remember that it was set up by the National Convention. It consisted of 12 deputies. It had numerous duties and powers. It oversaw the armies. It supervised the economy. It mobilized manpower and supplies for the war. It suspended local elections. It appointed national agents to influence local politics. And these were often deputies out on mission. It aided local authorities in taking control of their areas, particularly Jacobins, in all kinds of ways. It conducted forced recruitment. It aided tax equity, aided in building of armament factories and textile workshops and storage houses and communal facilities like bread ovens. They aided with rationing, distribution, and enforcing the general maximum that we just talked about. So how can we describe Robespierre's Republic of Virtue concept? And this is a difficult concept to follow, but I'm going to try to get this right. And if I miss the mark, don't judge me. So it all begins really with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Robespierre was a big fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, as we know, talked about the social contract in his book, The Social Contract. And it was a social contract. When he talked about it, we're not talking about a contract between the ruler and his people like, for example, Thomas Hobbes talked about, but rather a social contract between the people and each other. And as Rousseau discussed this concept, he talked about the general will. And the idea behind the general will was that the will of the people would always be in favor of the common good rather than being in favor of their own personal agendas. And this kind of self-denial among individuals for the common good takes a certain level of virtue cultivated in the minds and in the values of society. And if people have not attained that level of virtue, then you can pretty much just forget about a social contract guided by the general will. Robespierre did not think that a monarchy of any kind could teach this kind of virtue to the people. A monarchy bolstered by a clergy and an aristocracy, they're always going to put their own self-interests ahead of the common good. They always had. Privilege will always seek its own interests first. So how can a people attain this level of virtue that's necessary for a social contract guided by the general will under the authority of a monarchy? You can't do that under a monarchy. For that, you've got to have a republic that champions equality over privilege and liberty over domination. Robespierre called such a republic of virtue. And now we can see why. And whatever you have to do to protect and to nurture a republic of virtue, even if it's terror, whatever you have to do is justified. And this is especially true if somebody's level of virtue falls short of the level that a republic of virtue requires. that person is no longer worthy of the Republic. And when Robespierre's political rival, Georges Danton, became associated with friends of his who had taken bribes from the French East India Company, Georges Danton became, in Robespierre's mind, one of these people. And he went after Georges Danton, feeling totally justified, even if he had to block witnesses and use flimsy accusation at Danton's trial. And so this next question, who was or what was the Revolutionary Tribunal, and what powers did it have, particularly at the end of the Reign of Terror? This was a main instrument of the Reign of Terror, the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was a court that tried people for treason and issued the death penalty if they were convicted. Near the end of the Reign of Terror, the Revolutionary Tribunal operated under the law of 22 Prairial, and this law gave the Revolutionary Tribunal immense power. Defendants had to come to Paris for trial. They couldn't call witnesses or have their own defense attorneys, and death was the only penalty that the Revolutionary Tribunal issued. And so Robespierre, what eventually happened to Maximilien Robespierre? Robespierre finally made a deadly mistake when he spoke before the National Convention, and he made a speech in which he claimed that there were traitors right there in the National Convention, and he knew who they were, and he was going to have them all arrested and punished, but he didn't name names, and that left practically every single member of the National Convention wondering if they were going to be on that list. And so the next day, he was denounced and arrested right there at the convention, and the following day, after sustaining a gunshot wound during a scuffle in the middle of the night which shattered his jaw, Robespierre was guillotined, and thus began the period known as the Thermadorian reaction, which lasted for the next 15 months. So, who were the Thermadorians, and what did they stand for? The Thermadorians were practically a 180-degree turn from the direction that Robespierre and the Jacobins had been taking the country. It was a swing back towards conservatism, and it laid the blame for the Reign of Terror directly on the Jacobins, and it reinterpreted Robespierre as this heretic monster and this bloodthirsty tyrant, and that narrative would stick to Robespierre up to this very day. Once the Thermadorian reaction began, being a Jacobin was no longer cool and even quite dangerous. So, who were many of the most vocal Thermadorians? Ironically, many of these Thermadorians were themselves former Jacobins who had participated fully in the Reign of Terror throughout France. But they were especially skilled at distancing themselves from their past affiliations and even their past crimes. So that brings us to the Directory. So what was this Directory? How did it fall? The Directory was now a 5-man executive team that was specified in the latest Constitution of 1795. It was thought that a 5-man presidency would be a lot less corrupt than a 1-man presidency. And so instead of a president, you had a directory of 5 guys acting as president. But the directory was plagued by economic crisis, government bankruptcy, political infighting, warfare, of course, social unrest, government corruption, chronic inefficiency, and political weakness. And in 1799, Napoleon returned to France from Egypt and overthrew the Directory in a coup d'etat and took power. So this brings us to Napoleon. Napoleon is in charge now. He's in power. Some of the highlights, for example, what was Napoleon's Concordat of 1801? This was a reconciliation between France and the Catholic Church, in which the civil constitution of the clergy ended. There was no more loyalty oath that the priests had to take. And in return, Napoleon got to select bishops for the church and also got to run the church's finances in France. So, what was the structure of Napoleon's Grand Empire? And it had three parts to it, right? A kind of a, you know, I don't know, kind of like a target, with different lines going around it. It consisted of three parts, and the insidemost part was the core, and that was a greatly expanded France. Next to that, beyond that, outside of that, you had the satellites. And these were satellite states that did exactly what France wanted them to do. Napoleon put his relatives on the thrones of these satellite states, and he had no shortage of relatives to go around. He came from a really big family. And then finally, there were the Allies. And these countries, like, for example, Russia and Prussia and Austria, these were nominally independent, but they knew to toe the line because these countries had all been handily defeated by Napoleon. And he had made separate treaties with each of them on his own terms. And so, what was the Continental System? What was its purpose? How well did it work? This was an attempt to blockade British shipping and starve Napoleon's one last major enemy into submission, and that was Great Britain. This was not successful because Britain had plenty of blockading power of its own to use against Napoleon, and because some members of his Grand Empire actually refused to participate in the blockade. For example, Alexander the First of Russia initially promised his cooperation with the Continental System. But then he went back on his word. And so Napoleon actually wanted to punish Alexander I, and he invaded Russia in the year 1812. And that invasion, as we know, was a total disaster, and it cost Napoleon his entire empire. And he eventually had to abdicate from his throne in the year 1814. And so that is my entire discussion of this review. And so hopefully that will help you. I hope it helps you get a really great grade on this test. Good luck, and we will see you then.